morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. It's Monday, May 18th, 2020. And on this episode, we're going to go over the one thing that government consistently does really well at. And it's not good news for us, and that is they break your legs and then they offer you a process to fix it. They give you a wheelchair or a crutch. I'm going to cover things, of course, like the economy, but also get into some historical aspects of price fixing, maybe even the Department of Education, and some other things depending on some time. But first of all, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific Time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. We've got a bunch of different platforms we're on. We live stream video, and then we have archive video platforms, archive audio-only podcast editions. You can find all of the different platforms we're on, all of our archives, show notes for each episode with links to stuff that I'm referencing in every episode, plus the ways to follow us, like our social media channels, our email newsletter, and you can even support us with our membership program for as little as $2 a month. As you have heard me say before, if you've watched or listened before, we make it go a long, long, long way. I'm very grateful for everyone being here. I want to quick say hello to everyone out in the live chat. Oh, I didn't give the link, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty, all spelled out. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. That's where you get all the info, and you can follow us. I want to say hi to everyone in the live chat. I'm going to probably miss a few. It looks like there's a lot of great people joining me. Essential Freedom, Funky Euphemism. I got your email, buddy. I will get back to you in the next couple of days, probably. Bob Landry, Ward Lawrence, Bob Brewer down in Tyler B, Justin Bayola, SAH, Biochemist, Dan Warsaw, Melody Skaman, the Chicken Man, good to see you. Been a while. Larry Clark, good to see you back here on the show. Liberty Howell, Alan Hughes, Keith Redman in North Carolina over on Periscope. Nick Hancock, my great buddy. I just did an interview with him for his new podcast that I think is coming out pretty soon. Nick, give me a heads up when that's out. Nicole Williams, Justin Morrison, and I apologize if I skipped over him. Alan Christine is another one that I see out there as well. Anyways, I really am very grateful for you joining me today, but let's get right to this. I want to start out with a quote from a guy that was very influential on me as I transitioned from old school kind of government-loving statist pig to, I don't know, wherever we are today. Someone who doesn't trust either side, doesn't trust government at any level. And that's a guy named Harry Browne, who passed away a number of years ago, but he was a prolific writer going all the way back to the 1970s and was very influential on my mode of thought, pointing out that whenever government does something, even if they do, first of all, if they aren't lying about what they're going to do, they end up having future politicians expanding what they promised they would keep the limits to, or it just costs like 10 times as much. And this is a great quote from an article that was published over at antiwar.com back in 2002. And Harry was talking about foreign policy and how everyone was saying, if you oppose going into all kinds of wars, then you hate America. And he's like, look, what American foreign policy has done for decades has created a lot of problems, and now going to war and restricting liberties and Patriot Act and whatever may have come out of it, and I may have the timing all off, but basically this is a government fix based off of a government problem. He says the same routine is used by our government at home in comparison to the foreign policy, causing problems and then running to the rescue in education, healthcare, charity, farming, business, and most other areas of society. Government is good at one thing. It knows how to break your legs, hand you a crutch, and say, if it weren't for the government, you wouldn't be able to walk. And I think we can see this play out very well with the economy, with the crisis that so many people are going through, tens of millions of people and more added every single week, filing for unemployment to get money that was taken from in the first place in a bad economy that was created by government problems. So let's talk a little about that. But first, I want to point out that I kind of covered this type of approach and problems when we talk about supply chain issues in the meat industry. Now, some people may disagree with me and say there's no supply chain problems, but There certainly has been some issues in my view, and I talked about that in an episode back on May 8th, Meat Supply Chain Problems. Congress broke it 50 years ago. What they actually did, and just a quick summary, if you just haven't seen the episode, I encourage you to check it out. But basically 50 years ago, 1967, they passed something called the Wholesome Meat Act. This was supposedly going to protect people from rogue meat processors that were spreading disease and people were supposedly dying. A lot of that was propaganda, I believe. But they regulated basically thousands and thousands of small meat processors, meat plants out of business. They couldn't afford to keep up with it. When you add all kinds of layers of regulations and government control and checks and all that, what happens is the big government, the big corporations, the largest ones, are the only ones that can afford to deal with it. And I even pointed out in that episode that some of the smaller businesses were actually complaining that there was an unfair enforcement action. It's a lot easier to do enforcement actions on people that don't have a lot of money to fight it in court, whereas the large corporations, the Tysons or whatever of the world, they have the money to kind of drag things out and get their way. So when you take an industry that had thousands and thousands of processors, meat processors, and you create an environment where there's very few, what happens when you have one problem at one place, it makes it much easier for the entire chain to break down. And my buddy Mike Meharry put it this way. He said, centralized systems are brittle systems. They lack redundancy. They lack escape valves. They are prone to fail under stress. This is true of supply chains, economies, and governments. So in government at a centralized place, whether it's in a small geographic area or a large one like the United States, the more that government centralizes power, the greater the chance they have of causing problems for everybody. Government's going to screw up. They're going to attack liberty from no matter what. But when you reduce the amount of power, and this is what the founders' view was, you decentralize, you keep the most difficult, divisive, and important issues close to home. So when someone does something wrong, it only affects the people in a given geographic area, and they have an escape valve. They have an escape valve to go somewhere else. But enough on the meat supply issues. Let's talk about the economy, which I think is a total mess and set to get far worse. Other people are far better experts on this, but I've got some articles from Mises.org, from Meharry, who works for Peter Schiff at Schiff Gold, and then Foundation for Economic Education that I'll cover here briefly. Mike says, the truth is big government set the stage for this economic meltdown, just like it set the stage for the 2008 financial crisis. This is a prime example of the government breaking your legs and then giving you a wheelchair. He says, in a truly free market, businesses and consumers would have savings. These government shutdowns would stress a healthy economy, but they wouldn't kill it. So I'm not taking one side or the other on the government shutdowns in this episode, but let's say they are there. But if people and businesses had savings rather than being leveraged up on debt, which is driven by monetary manipulation through printing and interest rate manipulation from the Federal Reserve, people would have savings to weather a storm. That's the whole point. But Mike says, but we don't have a free market. We have a central bank that manipulates interest rates and a bloated government that taxes, borrows, and spends us into oblivion. Keep in mind that we live under the largest government in the history of the world. And I cannot stress that enough. The size of the U.S. government today is bigger than the next 10 to 12 combined. I think maybe it's like the next 8 combined, but it's close to the next 147 combined. And it probably is past that already as it continues to expand. And of course, we'll just get excuses from one party or the other, or one president or the other, as to why it just had to be done. So Mike says, as a result, the U.S. went into this pandemic with a bubble economy built on a mountain of debt. And that doesn't do well. All it needs now, maybe the current crisis is the pin, but the bubble is there, and then something was there to be pricked and deflated. Mike goes further. He says, by holding interest rates at artificially low levels, and this is just going to be a brief summary. This isn't the episode for a full Federal Reserve complaint or rant, but it's important to understand when you force interest rates too low, and he says for more than a decade after the 2008 financial crisis, mind you, they did this before the 2008 financial crisis, which led to that as well. the Federal Reserve incentivized borrowing. So it's more likely that people will go into debt if they can get a 0% APR or if they can get a 3% loan than if they can get 5 or 10 or 15%. So it encourages, by manipulating these interest rates, forcing them lower rather than letting the market figure it out, they're creating an environment where people and corporations take on debt. You look at some of the airlines, they are so leveraged up, they couldn't go weeks with a downturn in business. They always have to be at full capacity. They are not capable. So they're managed poorly. And I do understand that the manipulation from government and the Fed is a serious problem. But if you don't run your business well, you should go bankrupt so other people can step in, buy the stuff, buy the products, buy the equipment, buy the locations at a much cheaper price and run it well. Mike goes on. He says they incentivize borrowing. As a result, consumer debt, corporate debt, and the national debt were all at record levels before any of this crap started. Meanwhile, the federal government, he writes, was already spending trillions of dollars to prop up the economy. We heard over and over that we are living under the greatest economy in the history of everything, but this was a total propaganda lie. Anyone who falls for this, either it just isn't paying attention or is lying, I guess. The administration was on track to run a $1 trillion budget deficit even in 2020, even before the pandemic even started. So this is a serious problem. It's something that's been happening, and no one should be surprised at the high unemployment, businesses going under, businesses closing, and what may come 6, 8 months down the line or a year down the line when, as things open up, what are the odds that a lot of people are like, well, I don't know. Instead of spending so much money, I got a lot of friends that still haven't gotten hired back. Maybe I'll do carry out or I'll make my own food. So I think a lot of service industry, a lot of travel industry is going to struggle. It may be an early bump when people start getting out and about. But I think just people are recognizing that this is a significant problem that we're all facing. Here's an interesting, just quick chart that came from an article over at Mises Institute by Ryan McMacken, I believe. Yeah, just a couple of days ago. And he's pointing out, again, the federal deficit. This was adjusted for 2019 dollars. If you look at this chart, I mean, it's pretty bad. I mean, it's not up to the previous guy's levels yet, but it's very likely that we're going to hit a record level for this year. Worse than after the 2008 crisis. So worse, the worst in history ever. And there is no excuse for that. And it was already rising in 2016, it had gone down to, well, I don't want to say low levels. It went back down to the Bush administration time in 2013 and 2014, has been going up ever since. 2017, 18, 19, a consistent growth. And 2020 is going to be an absolute nightmare. So they've been spending, they've been borrowing, they've been running people into debt, they've been manipulating the economy, printing, and causing problems all along. And it doesn't matter which team is in charge, who holds the White House, or what team occupies Congress or runs Congress. It's always a mess. And this is from Frank, I don't know how to say his last name, Shostak, over at Mises. He writes a lot of great articles on the Fed, and he puts it this way. Whenever governments borrow the resources that they do not have. Now, mind you, governments don't have resources. The only thing they have is what they take from you or steal from you. He says, well, whenever they borrow, they've in fact deprive some wealth-generating businesses of those resources because the money has to be paid. It comes from somewhere, either through paying it back, higher taxes, or through inflation. And that inflation meaning an increase in money supply, which ends up resulting in price increases. Frank goes on, he says, likewise, when the central bank embarks on an aggressive monetary pumping to reduce the liquidity difficulties of various businesses, propping up businesses that should go out of business, should go bankrupt, it sets in motion the transfer of real savings from wealth generators to the holders of the newly injected money. In other words, it's definitely going to help out the big boys, the big corporations, the corporate backers, the lobbyists, and the like. And Frank sums it up by saying this undermines the process of real wealth generation and subsequently weakens the foundations of the economy. And they've been doing this over and over, and they have this boom-bust cycle, which is generated. Well, there's boom and bust even before central banks, but it exacerbates it. It makes it far worse, longer, deeper, and more painful. And everything that they do to try to dig out of it is the same thing that caused it. So again, government is helping us by harming us in the first place. And I forget who wrote this. Oh, John Miltimore. I think he's the editorial director, maybe. What is it? Over at Managing Editor of FEE, Foundation for Economic Education. And he's talking about a couple of things going back in history. Same type of thing, propping up prices and the like. This is the Smoot-Hawley tariff. He says a lot of people, and he was talking about this great clip from Ferris Bueller's Day Off where they're talking about this and how they kind of got it wrong. But a lot of people get this wrong. And he sums it up this way. He says, designed to protect Americans during the economic crisis of that time, 1920s and 30s, Smoot-Hawley proved disastrous. Imports fell from 1 point whatever million down, it's like 70% drop from 1929 to 1932. Trade went down, and by 1933, unemployment was 25%, the highest in history. I wonder how he compare with that today. To correct things, and I like how he puts correct in scare quotes because it's a fake correction, Americans elected FDR, who launched a series of federal programs which made the crisis even worse. The rest, as they say, is history. And I just wanted to briefly point that out. This is another example. This is not something new. This isn't the current people that are doing the things. These are the things that have been part of the system and consistent for decades. But John goes on a little bit further, talking about this book, Basic Economics, from Thomas Sowell. He says Sowell recounts several instances in which governments turned small problems into major ones by using blunt force. I've not read this book. If you have, I'm interested in your feedback. Nick, I have a funny feeling you've read this. I've only seen it cited a bunch of times, and I don't read a lot of economic books, but this one seems really interesting because Sowell, every time I see about it, talking about historical examples. But Sowell talks about how governments turned small problems into major ones by using blunt force, often price controls, to respond to public panic about rising costs of a given economy. One of the more famous examples of this is the gasoline crisis of the 70s. A little bit before my time. I mean, I lived through it. I was a baby, but I mean, I've seen documentaries, I'm sure, and I've read a little bit about it as well. But he says this started when the federal government took a small problem, which was temporary high costs of gasoline, and turned it into a big one, a national shortage, which is, I think, the same type of thing we see in meat supply and so many other things right now. A shortage in employment, a shortage in the labor force, a shortage in ability to buy things. There's all kinds of shortages that are being caused by government action. He says it began when OPEC, a newly formed oil cartel, cut oil production, causing fuel prices to rise. To address this rise, the Nixon administration, and then later the Ford and Carter ones, resorted to price controls to keep fuel prices low for consumers. So even though the cost of production was going up, they were forcing the prices to go down. What's the result? Mass fuel shortages across the country that led to long lines and many Americans unable to buy fuel. This energy crisis, as it was dubbed at the time, in turn wreaked havoc on the automotive industry, and that probably wreaked havoc on some other things and caused issues in foreign policy and on and on and on. So trying to fix things, when government tries to fix things, usually government already broke it. But even if government didn't break it in the first place, you don't want, what's the old saying? I'm from the government and I'm here to help is one of the scariest 9 words or whatever that you'll ever hear. I agree that the last people that you want doing this are elected politicians or unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats who know nothing about the given industry. We can cover education a little bit too, and I was surprised to see this in the Detroit News. It was written by a guy from the Heartland Institute, which does a lot of free market-ish type of stuff, a guy named Chris Talgo. And he puts it this way: in 1979, we forget the Department of Education. I'm kind of going on a side here. We forget the Department of Education, in the grand scheme of things, was relatively new. How did people who were so into education, making sure the public was aware of things like Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Patrick Henry, and others, how did they get by without a national Department of Education? Remember back in the day, Republicans, when they still sometimes pretended to be constitutionalists, they used to campaign on getting rid of this thing. But that doesn't last long. Once it gets part of the system, they all are okay with it. Same thing's happening with the Affordable Care Act as well. The Department of Education was established in 1979 to, quote, promote student achievement and preparation for global competitiveness by fostering educational excellence and ensuring equal access. Unfortunately, Chris writes, the department has failed miserably in this mission. Despite a budget of more than $68 billion and 4,000 employees as of the time that he wrote this, this was September of last year, so maybe it's changed. The Education Department has done little, if anything, to improve student achievement. I would make the case that government involved involvement of education makes people dumb. I make comments all the time about, like, if I'm on an interview and someone says, oh, I'm trying to do a math problem or I'm trying to locate something, some simple answer. If I don't know, my first response is, well, I'm not good at math or I'm not good at geography because I went to government schools. And I didn't learn much. I mean, I did almost nothing and I got A's and B's all the time. I'm not saying that I'm not an intelligent person, but it was totally not challenging. And even if you have someone that may be at a higher intelligence than maybe the median, the one-size-fits-all solution is a problem, because then it makes it too difficult for people who need special help. And I know they have special needs classes, but not everyone qualifies for that. So it only is good for the people in the middle, the soft mediocre. Not to say that mediocre is bad, but it's a problem when people who are further advanced have struggles because it's too easy. I acted out because I'd throw books at teachers because they wouldn't call on me anymore. One teacher in 5th grade literally said to me, Michael, we know that you know the answer to this. I was so excited to answer a question. He said, I'm just not going to call on you anymore. And so I was left out. I couldn't participate. I was excited to participate. I just started really, really acting out. Now, that's my own personal example, but I think there are probably many others who went through this kind of thing as well. And then people who are struggling that maybe don't get into a special needs or special education classes, they're really struggling for the one-size-fits-all as well. One-size-fits-all is a serious problem. So enough of that rant, but going further, Chris says, according to the most recent results from the nation's report card, only 12% of 12th grade students scored at or above proficient in U.S. history. And mind you, not that I want people to be proficient in the U.S. history that the government propaganda institutions are teaching, but even based on their own educational system, what they're teaching, only 12% are good or proficient. So in a weird way, maybe that's a win, because we don't want them to learn the propaganda. The results were not much better for science, which is 22%, math 25%, and reading 37%. He says, I guess this is why it got it in my head, because I was reading through this. I saw him say one size fits all, but he put it this way. The situation is made worse by the public school one size fits all approach to education. Unfortunately, this repressive method is a staple of government programs. It fails to address the distinctive needs and circumstances of individuals. The one-size-fits-all strategy is draconian and inevitably leads to unintended consequences. Maybe for some people, those consequences are intended. And I thought this was pretty interesting from John Stossel. This is like a 2007 article over at Town Hall, which I don't read too often, but I thought Stossel did a pretty good job. This big government conservative was basically saying, well, we need government to come in and fix things, and government, like, we've just had the wrong people in charge. And I saw a similar article like that last year in The Hill from Charlie Kirk of Turning Point USA, complaining about how some conservatives that should be aligning with him complain that government shouldn't even be involved. And he's basically saying, well, government is involved. Let's get our team to run the show and make it better. And he had this whole multi-point plan, but that's not how it ends up playing out, because whenever you give them power to do something, even if you have the people that you like in charge today, eventually someone else is going to be in charge. And we've seen how this plays out in everything, whether it's surveillance and privacy, the right to keep and bear arms. They take away your right to protect yourselves, and then they have to arm up police, and then they have a drug war. It goes on and on and on. Domino effect everywhere. And Stossel, I thought, just this one statement really summed up his opposition to this. Like, you can't blame the market for this. Government isn't going to fix things. He says, excuse me. And I guess this guy was basically, he was responding to this guy who's not only saying, well, let's get the reins of it, but the market is screwing everything up on this too. And he says, excuse me, but why is that the market's fault? Government dominates education in America. K through 12 education is a coercive, often rigidly unionized government virtual monopoly that fights every attempt to experiment with free market competition. I mean, even when you go to a private school, you still have to get approval of the texts and the things that you use. There is I guess there's probably a little bit more flexibility, but you still have to conform to government regulations. So it still isn't truly, even the private schools are not truly free market. I don't think they're even close. Now back to the economy and what we're facing today. I want to cover Meharry. He has this, it's a kind of a long paragraph. I'm sorry for reading so much. It's just that I think so many other people I wanted to share with you their thoughts were so good to summarize these points. But he says, this is not to say because he's talking about, and again, I can just reiterate, if the economy was healthy, some businesses would be able to weather the storm. Some people would be able to weather the storm of losing their jobs, whatever it may be. But he says that's not to say that these shutdowns would have been a walk in the park if the economy wasn't already broken. It's not a silver bullet. It's just that you can withstand difficulties better when you're preparing, you're taking care of yourself. Some people prep by storing meat and food and survival goods and things like that. And you also have to think about the monetary issue, sound money, gold and silver, and cash on hand. But businesses and a lot of people just aren't able to do that because of the environment. Some people don't do it because they're just not smart about it, but other people, it's a great way to bring a population to their knees is to make them have to work more and more and more to earn the same amount of purchasing power. And that's the insidious attack of inflation, which leads to price increases. Mike goes on. He says, a healthy economy could have weathered the storm, at least. If the Fed hadn't intervened in the economy, people wouldn't have been able to bury themselves in debt, I would say, as easily. If the government wasn't levying high taxes on corporate earnings, companies would have had more money saved to push through a crisis. And if people didn't rely on government programs like Social Security, which I know a lot of people are like, well, it's my retirement funding, but would you have chosen Social Security had the government not said you have to take it? They're going to take it under the threat of you going to jail if you try to withhold that money. I mean, that's really what we're getting down to. That is not a voluntary program. That is force and violence to create a scenario where people rely on government once again. They're building more and more people. They're building systems to make everyone reliant on government, and then the less likely they'll be to oppose government or those programs. And Mike says, if people didn't rely on government programs like Social Security for their savings, they could have saved their own money. And they would have had it to tap into during the crisis. I mean, certainly free market solutions may have provided different situations. Maybe you have to pay a penalty. I've seen people do 401ks, but you get some kind of access. You don't have a savings account under Social Security. No, that money is taken from you to pay for the current generation of Social Security beneficiaries, I guess we'll call it. Recipients, we'll say recipients, victims. And he quotes Peter Schiff here, which I think was a great summary. He says, it's the government that crippled the economy in the first place. The solution, the answer to that, is not to have a bigger government crutch so we can hobble around. How about getting rid of all that government? Liberating the economy from the dead weight of government. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. It's kind of basically saying... It's basically a bunch of examples of saying the same thing over and over. It's 30 minutes of saying, look, government fixes are usually there for government problems. And when they're not, they're going to make things worse almost every single time. And even where they seem to actually get things right, it either takes way longer, there's a lot of mission creep, someone's going to abuse those powers in the future, or it costs 5, 10, 15, way more than they ever said it would cost in the first place. Funky Euphemism said, I've actually spent a lot of time trying to opt out of Social Security with some kind of affidavit. David, impossible to do. Rick Hicks says Social Security wasn't meant to be the sole retirement. It's supplemental. Too many think it's all you need. Well, certainly it's almost impossible to live on that. But when they're forcing you to participate in it, you can't even make your own choices. Government supplemental means government ripoff in my mind. Jane Stetz Peterson says, no, I would not have chosen a government program for anything to rely on. Alan Hughes says it was voluntary at first. I don't know really the history of that. Alan, if you've got a link to an article or a book that you suggest on understanding the history of that, I would really appreciate that. I'll take a look at that as well. Taking a look a little bit further, Larry Clark, Department of Education is government indoctrination. And Patricia Dance, kind of what I was hinting at, barely. I think you summed this up, Patricia, pretty well. Actually, government-run schools have achieved their goals perfectly. Everyone begs for servitude, mission accomplished. And they don't learn real history. And if they learn anything about the Constitution, they learn from Marbury versus Madison. They learn that the Constitution means what the Supreme Court says it means until it changes its mind. Tom, this is me, that last one. Tom Horniak, I think I apologize if I got your name wrong, over on Facebook says, I trust flying in a plane with a blind pilot. I trust flying in a plane with a blind pilot before I would trust a government program. Well, I think we're all together on this stuff. I'm very grateful for you being here. I'm not sure if you learned something new, but if you did, I hope so. I'll put a lot of links. There's some interesting reading from Fee and from Mises and Meharry, and that old article from Harry Brown is pretty cool on foreign policy. I'll link to that in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. If you support the show, there's a lot of free actions that you can take. It just takes a few seconds. Smash the like button on whatever platform you're on. You can subscribe. YouTube, for example, if you're on YouTube, get notifications. Hit that bell to get notifications. iTunes or whatever podcast platform, if you're listening, leave a review. I'm so grateful for all the reviews, especially considering the fact that I hadn't even thought of doing an audio-only podcast edition when I first started the show. I was just going to do live stream video, and that was it. So I'm very grateful for that. And all these things tell the platforms to show the program to more people. The algorithms are very easily triggered. So thank you very much for that. And if you really want to pitch in, our membership program starts out as little as $2 a month. I promise whatever work that we do to help educate people, we're not going out there trying to break people's legs like government is and coming in as the savior. We really want people to learn the truth about history, the truth about what we're facing, and that what we're facing is the largest government, largest empire in the history of the world, and there is no easy fix, but we got to be dedicated to the Constitution and liberty for the long run. So if you want to support us financially, I see a number of people out there who are members, and I'm very grateful for that. Don't feel any pressure to join, but if you are able to, it's as little as $2 a month. We make it pretty cheap, and we're a big, happy family. 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Thank you again for joining me today. I hope you had a good weekend. I hope your Monday is off to a good start, and I'll see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.